I died in the middle of the ocean. Didn't drown, didn't sink. I simply stopped existing, and 1 second later, I opened my eyes again. The first thing I felt was cold. Not the cold of a room or a winter morning. The cold of deep water pressing against every surface of my body at once. The second thing I noticed, I couldn't move my arms. Because I no longer had arms. I had for small, clawed flippers. And a shell. Hard, tight, and small as a fist. I tried to scream. What came out was a stream of bubbles that floated upward and vanished without a sound. That was how my second life began. Inside the body of a turtle the size of a man's fist. Somewhere deep beneath the ocean's surface, where the pressure alone should have crushed me flat. But the shell held. That was the first thing I noticed. The pressure wasn't breaking me. Whatever this body was, it was built to survive things that should have been impossible. I floated in the darkness and tried to understand what had just happened to me. My first life ended quietly. I wasn't a warrior, wasn't a mensch, wasn't a noble or a merchant or a hero of any kind. I was a wanderer, a man who walked from city to city, collected stories, and sold them to scribes and librarians who needed content for their shelves. No great deeds, no special power, just legs, roads, and 10,000 other people's stories living inside my head. I died stupidly, crossing the gray strait on a merchant barge during a midnight storm. I held onto the railing, then the railing disappeared. Then I disappeared. The last thing I remember was stores above black water and a thought that I had spent my whole life recording everyone else's story and never once written my own. It seemed the universe had decided to give me a second chance at that. For the first 3 days inside my new body, I simply drifted. The current pulled me north toward colder water. I had no destination, no plan, no idea where I was. But I had something more important. I had time to think, and in my experience, time to think was worth more than a sword. I ate small crustaceans, algae, microscopic things that floated past my mouth each time I ate. Something strange happened. The shell grew, not from the food itself, but after every meal, I could feel the outer surface of my shell shift, just barely, just slightly, becoming marginally denser. I noticed it on day 4. Then I started paying attention. On day 4, I also met my first serious problem. A flathead predator with nail-like teeth and eyes that tracked movement the way a cat tracks a mouse. It stared at me the way things stare at food. I tried to swim away. Turtles are slow. That was an important lesson to learn early. The fish rammed me with its snout. I spun through the water. It hit me again and again. The shell didn't crack. The teeth slid off without leaving a mark. After the 5th attempt, the fish gave up and disappeared into the dark water. I hung there in the current, slowly processing what had just happened. I couldn't be broken down at all by anything this ocean had thrown at me so far. That realization changed everything about how I thought about this life. In my first life, I survived by being careful, by listening more than I spoke, by avoiding danger rather than walking through it. In this life, I had no speed, no strength, no magic. I was a turtle the size of a fist, but I had a shell that nothing could crack, and I had a head full of other people's stories, including a very specific one I hadn't thought about in years. An old fisherman from a port city used to tell it on winter evenings to anyone who would listen. The story of the ancient turtles, creatures that lived for thousands of years, grew to the size of small continents, and carried entire ecosystems on their backs. I had written it down and filed it under beautiful legend. Now, floating alone in a cold ocean inside a turtle's body, I was no longer certain it was only a legend. On day 7, something shifted inside me. Not pain, more like pressure, as if something that had been sleeping very deep inside this body was just beginning to wake up. I stopped moving and paid attention. In my first life, listening was my greatest skill. I use it now. What I heard wasn't a sound, it was a sensation. Something rising from the very core of my existence, like a signal being broadcast from somewhere beneath conscious thought. A system. That's what I called it, because that's what it felt like. The kind of progression mechanic I'd read about in the fantasy novels that had started appearing in cities a few years before my death. Except in those stories, the system appeared immediately, handed to you like a gift on the first page. This one had taken 7 days, as if it had been watching, waiting to see whether I deserved it. The first message was short. Shell resonance, level 1. Every impact absorbed by the shell increases its density by 0.001%. I read it several times. 0.001%. Per impact. That sounded laughably small, but I had spent my life talking to merchants, and merchants taught me to respect compounding numbers. 1,000 impacts plus 1%, 10,000 plus 10, 100,000 plus 100. And in an ocean full of things that wanted to eat me, impacts were not going to be in short supply. This wasn't a weakness, it was a resource. The most abundant resource in the ocean. I started looking for trouble on purpose, which sounds insane. But I had a plan, or at least the beginning of one. Small predators first. Fish with teeth, crabs with claws, sea snakes with blunt heads that struck instinctively at anything that moved. I would approach, show myself, take the hit, swim away, return an hour later, repeat. The system clicked every single time. 0.001% again. By day 12, I was the size of to open hands. The shell had darkened to something close to black and felt noticeably denser when I pressed a flipper against it. The local predators had stopped attacking. They'd learned, the hard way, that their teeth went dull against me before I went anywhere, which meant I needed bigger predators. I felt them before I saw them. Heavy rhythmic vibrations moving through the water from the northeast. 7 sharks, each one 3 times the length of a grown man, moving in loose formation like a patrol unit. A sensible creature would have gone the other direction. I swam toward them. The first shark hit me with its tail by accident. I'd simply appeared in its path. The impact sent me spinning 30 meters through the water. I counted the hits as I tumbled. System, plus 0.001%, plus 0.001%, plus 0.001%. 3 impacts from 1 collision. Not bad. The shark turned and looked at me properly this time. Then it attacked the way sharks attack, like a battering ram with teeth. I didn't dodge. I just pulled into my shell. The force of it drove me 50 meters straight down, but the shell didn't crack, didn't even flex. System, plus 0.001%. New impact type registered. Pressure adaptation initiated. Pressure adaptation. That was a new word. I filed it carefully and waited to understand what it meant. I spent 3 days with that shark pack. They couldn't eat me, but didn't understand that immediately. Every few hours, one of them would try again. By the end of day 3, they had given up and moved on. I surfaced slowly, feeling different in a way I couldn't immediately measure. The system had been quiet for almost a full day. Then, shell resonance, level 2. New ability unlocked, pressure absorption. External pressure is now converted directly into shell growth. Not just impacts, pressure itself. The weight of the ocean. The deeper I swam, the harder it pushed against me, and now every pound of that push was making me stronger. I dove out 100 meters, 200, 500. At each depth I felt the shell adjust, compact, reinforce, adapt. At 1,000 meters the pressure would have crushed an iron sphere. My shell simply grew. 1 month passed. I was the size of a large shield. 3 months, the size of a cart. 6 months, the size of a small house. Predators now turned and fled when I came near. Even the large ones. Even the ones that had never met me before, as if something in their instincts recognized what I was becoming. But this created a new problem. Fewer attacks meant slower growth. I needed something else. Something that produced constant, sustained pressure rather than individual impacts. The answer came to me as a vibration in the water, rhythmic, powerful, pulling like a heartbeat from somewhere to the east. A whirlpool enormous, the kind that appeared at the edge of deep ocean trenches, where competing currents tore the water apart. I could feel it from 3 miles away. Inside the whirlpool, the pressure would be variable, shifting, crushing from every direction simultaneously. It would have destroyed a wooden ship in seconds. System, sustained pressure source detected. Accelerated adaptation mode activated. I swam into it slowly, felt the current grab me and begin to spin, felt the pressure multiply and shift and build. I stayed for 7 days. When I came out, I was the size of a small island, and the world began to treat me differently. The first things to arrive were birds. They simply landed, because my shell now broke the surface of the water into a seabird. A flat surface above the waves is a flat surface above the waves. Then came algae, attaching to the edges of the shell where it met the waterline. Then small fish sheltering in the shadow beneath my body. Then crabs picking at the algae. I had become part of an ecosystem without deciding to, just by being large and still. The system processed this quietly for 3 days. Then, new ability unlocked. Life anchor. Living creatures residing on or near the host provide a steady return of life energy. The greater the diversity and number, the stronger the flow. Life energy from living things. Every creature that chose to exist near me was giving me something in return for the shelter I provided. I thought about that for a long time, floating motionless while birds argued over nesting positions above me. In my first life I had collected stories, listened to people, given them an audience in exchange for their words. And somehow that exchange had always felt like the most natural thing in the world. This was the same thing. just at a different scale, with different participants. I started shaping the surface deliberately, slowly, carefully. The system called it shell architecture. Unlocked at level 3, I began to form a shallow depression near my center. Rain filled it within a week. A small freshwater pool, circular and still. Birds found it within 2 days. Drank. Stayed. Brought seeds. The first plants appeared 3 weeks later. Within 2 months, I had a meadow with a lake at its center. The life anchor ability registered a 340% increase in energy return. 340% for 1 meadow and 1 lake. I began to understand the logic of this world very clearly. Trees came on their own, seeds carried by birds and wind. The first grew in a month. Then 10, then 50. By the end of that season, I had a forest, real, layered, alive, with birdsong and insects and small mammals that had arrived on the wind or on the feet of larger birds. Ships began to slow down when they passed. Captains raised their telescopes. An island that hadn't been there the year before. An island that was growing. Sailors are superstitious people. New islands make them nervous. But nervous only lasts until you know what's inside. The first humans came 8 months after I took my position. Not merchants, not soldiers, fishermen. A small boat with 3 people, an old man and 2 young ones. Father and sons, clearly, looking for shelter from a storm that was building fast in the west. The boat entered the cove I had shaped on my southern side, narrow entrance. Wide protected interior, calm water inside regardless of what the sea was doing outside. They didn't immediately realize the cove had been shaped. They thought it was natural. Storms happen fast, and you don't stop to ask questions when you're running from one. They waited to nights, and for those nights, I listened to their conversations the way I used to listen to travelers around a fire in my first life. The old man had fished these waters for 50 years. He knew every reef, every current, every island, and he knew with absolute certainty that this island had not been here 3 years ago. He said it quietly, after the sons had fallen asleep, talking to himself, or to the water, or to whoever might be listening. 3 years ago, this was open sea, he said. Islands don't grow in 3 years. Not real islands. A pause. The fire crackled. Unless it's not really an island. He was the smartest person who had found me so far. Smarter than the pirate captain who had simply turned away from something he didn't understand. This man was sitting with a mystery rather than running from it. I felt something close to respect. On the 3rd morning, when the storm had passed, the old man walked to the water's edge alone, knelt down on one knee, and said, out loud, to the empty air, "I don't know what you are, but you gave us shelter. We're grateful." Then he stood up, went to help his sons prepare the boat, and didn't mention it again. The system responded instantly. First acknowledgement received. New ability unlocked. Island Echo. The host may now generate subtle environmental responses, shifts in wind, water movement, accelerated plant growth, without revealing its nature. Island Echo. A way to communicate, not with words, with the language of place, the language that sailors and fishermen already knew how to read. When the fishing boat left the cove that morning, I changed the current at the entrance, just slightly, just enough to give them a smoother exit and a bit of extra speed. The wind picked up in exactly the direction they needed, more than it should have naturally. The old man felt it. He turned and looked back at the island for a long moment. Then he nodded once, short and certain, the nod of a man confirming something he had already suspected. He turned back to the sea and didn't look back again. But I knew what would happen next. The old man would tell his sons this story. His sons would tell their children. Their children would tell other fishermen. The fishermen would tell port workers. The port workers would tell merchants. The story of a kind island that sheltered travelers from storms. I had spent my entire first life learning how stories move through the world. I knew exactly how far this one would travel. The next ship came 2 months later. Not by accident. A small reconnaissance sloop flying the flag of the Stone Kingdom. For men aboard with an obvious assignment. Verify the rumors about a new island appearing at the crossing of 3 trade routes. They spent 3 days mapping me. One of them was a cartographer, young, methodical, expensive instruments. He measured the coastline, the depth of the coves, the height of the trees, the composition of the soil. I watched him work from the water's reflection while he sat on the southern shore making final notes. The map was accurate, the cove, the forest, the central lake, and in the corner, a notation, Turtle Island. Origin unknown. Further investigation recommended. Turtle Island. They had no idea how precisely they had named it. The reconnaissance team left. They took the map. They took soil samples and water samples and their own careful observations. They took the story, and I settled into wait because I understood what came next. The map would reach military advisors in the Stone Kingdom capital. The advisors would note the strategic position, a natural harbor at the intersection of 3 trade routes. No existing owner, no garrison. No flag. They would recommend the king pay attention. Other ships would come, with different intentions entirely. They would recommend the king pay attention. Other ships would come, with different intentions. I had time to prepare. Not much, but enough. I began reshaping the underwater approaches in earnest. The system had unlocked a new branch, living barrier. I could now create underwater formations, reefs, shallows, currents, within a 5-mile radius of my body. 5 miles of controlled approaches. 5 miles of invisible defense that appeared on no map. Southern approach, shallow water with sharp hidden formations just below visibility depth. 1 safe channel, known only to me. Northern approach, powerful opposing current, nearly impassable for heavy ships. Eastern approach, narrow but clean, for those who knew the way. Western approach, left open, for emergencies. 3 months of quiet, invisible, patient work beneath the surface. No map in the world could show what I had built down there. By the time the Stone Kingdom's first serious ship appeared on the horizon, the island looked defenseless. It was anything but. The ship that came was a war galleon, 22 guns, 80 crew, and behind it, to transport vessels carrying timber, stone, and 6 months of provisions. They were planning to stay. I watched them enter the main cove, watched the anchors drop, watched the gangplanks extend and the unloading begin. Felt every boot that stepped onto my shell, every pickaxe that bit into my surface to set a foundation post. System, shell resonance registering sustained mechanical impact, plus 0.001% per strike. Construction activity logged. They were building on me, and in doing so, they were making me stronger. Every hammer blow, every driven stake, every chisel strike, all of it feeding directly into my shell. The irony was so complete I would have laughed out loud if turtles were capable of it. The garrison commander was a man named Arden, 50 years old, gray at the temples, with the habit of walking the shore alone at first light. On his very first morning, he came out alone before the others were awake, stood at the waterline and looked out at the sea for a long time. Then he crouched, picked up a small dark stone, and turned it over in his hands. "Strange island," he said aloud. To no one, just said it. I let the wind move through the leaves above him. A quiet sound, just at the edge of hearing. Arden went still, looked at the trees. Then the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close to it. He put the stone in his pocket and walked back to the camp. A man who collects evidence rather than running from it. I filed that away carefully. Construction moved fast. Arden ran his people without wasted motion. By the end of the first week there was a perimeter. By the end of the second, a foundation. I helped, invisibly. Where they planned a foundation, I raised the shell surface by exactly the right amount to give them a level base. Where they dug a well, I ran an underground channel to a freshwater source I had known about for months. The water appeared on day 3 of digging. The workers considered themselves lucky. Arden looked at the tree line again. He was already putting it together. But experienced soldiers know how to accept useful things without asking uncomfortable questions. The first pirate fleet came 3 months into the garrison. Not 3 ships this time, 17. Arden saw them from the watchtower 2 hours out, organized his defenses calmly, gave clear orders without raising his voice, loaded the guns and positioned his men. Then he walked the perimeter one more time. Alone. Thinking. I watched the fleet from underwater. 17 ships against 1 galleon and 80 men on shore. Arden knew the math. He wasn't panicking, but he understood what it meant. I decided that a man like that deserved the help I could give. When the pirate fleet moved into the strait between my southern edge and the nearest reef, I adjusted the current, not suddenly, gradually, the way a tide shifts. Natural feeling. Slow. The reef on the far side had formations I knew better than any navigator alive. I had grown up around them. 2 of the lead ships drifted slightly right, just slightly. The current pushed them by maybe 8 degrees from their intended course. The first grinding sound came about 20 minutes later, then a second, to ships hard aground on formations that appeared on no chart. Because they had appeared only 3 months ago, the fleet stopped, began maneuvering to assist. The attack dissolved into a rescue operation before it had properly begun. Arden lowered his telescope slowly, turned to look at the island, at the trees, at the stone and soil surface of the place he had been stationed. He stood very still for a moment, then he nodded. Once. Exactly the same nod the old fisherman had given. The fleet was gone by morning, left behind a damaged ship's worth of scattered equipment, and a story that would spread through every pirate port in the region. The island that couldn't be attacked from the sea. That night, After his men had celebrated and gone to sleep, Arden came back to the water alone. He took out a small knife, drew it lightly across his palm, just enough. Let 3 drops of blood fall into the water at the shore. An old sailor's ritual. Gratitude to the spirit of a place. I felt it the moment it hit the water. Intentional, aware. An acknowledgement from a man who knew exactly what he was acknowledging. System. Second acknowledgement received. Acknowledgement from a commander. New ability unlocked. Bond with the acknowledged. The host may now sense the intentions and emotional state of individuals who have performed acknowledgement. I felt Arden immediately. Not thoughts, not words. Intention. Direction. The deep underlying purpose of a person. What I felt from him was simple and absolute. This man intended to stay here for the rest of his life. Spring brought trade ships. The rumors about a safe island at the crossing of 3 major trade routes had reached enough captains that several decided to verify personally. Arden handled them well, allowed them to dock, charged a modest fee, sold water and provisions at fair prices. The island was functioning as a port, small, unofficial, but functional and growing. I watched and planned the next step. A port without real protection is just a target with a welcome sign. I had the underwater defenses already, but I needed something deeper than that. Something that would make the island not just safe to visit, but impossible to take by force from anyone who tried. The system answered before I had finished forming the question. Sufficient life energy accumulated. New development branch available. Resonant depths. The host may now create internal structures within the shell. Tunnels. Chambers. CHANNELS accessible from the surface through controlled openings. Tunnels. Chambers. An entire hidden architecture beneath the surface of what everyone above believed was simply an island. Beneath the forest. Beneath the garrison. Beneath the fort that Arden's men were quietly expanding. A second island, invisible, known only to me, where I could put things and people that I needed kept safe. I began working immediately, quietly, patiently, the way I did everything. The tunnel network grew over for months. Main passage running east to west beneath the island's center. Branch tunnels extending to each cove. A large chamber beneath the freshwater lake, accessible by diving through a concealed opening in the lake bottom. Above, the garrison grew. Arden wrote to the Stone Kingdom capital. The letter described the island's strategic value, its trading income, its inexplicable ability to repel naval attacks. The capital answered, send 200 soldiers. Establish Fort Turtle officially. Confirm Arden as first commandant. Fort Turtle, still accurate. The 200 soldiers came in early spring. With them came 20 builders, 3 licensed merchants, and 1 person I noticed immediately. Not because of anything he wore or carried, but because of how he moved. He walked the island differently from everyone else, looked at things differently. Not the look of a soldier assessing a defensive position or a merchant calculating profit. The look of someone assembling a puzzle, patiently, one piece at a time. He spent 3 days alone before he approached Arden and handed him a letter. Arden read it, looked up at the quiet man, read it again, then stood very still for a moment, looking at the tree line. I didn't know what was in that letter, not yet, but through my bond with Arden I felt it clearly. Something had changed, something significant. Whatever the letter said, it meant this quiet man was not here as a soldier or a merchant. He was here for a different reason entirely, a reason that Arden had not been told about in advance. The man set up his tent away from the others, began writing in a journal each evening. Every night, he came to the water alone and looked at it for a long time. I watched him from beneath the surface and thought, carefully, patiently, about whether this person was a problem or an opportunity. In my first life, the question had always been the most important one. The answer was almost never obvious from the outside. You had to watch, wait, listen. I was very good at waiting. The island grew. The people built. The trade routes shifted slightly. The way water shifts around a new stone and a stream to include this place in their calculations. And deep beneath the surface, in the dark of my own internal chambers, the tunnels extended quietly outward, known to no chart, no map, no record. I had spent my first life collecting other people's stories, recording them, preserving them, giving them to anyone who would pay to read them. This life was going to be different. This time, I was the story, and it was only just beginning. Every empire starts somewhere. Mine started at the bottom of an ocean, in a body the size of a fist. Drop your best theory in the comments. I'll answer the most interesting one in part 2. The quiet man's name was Solon. I learned that on his 4th day on the island, when Arden finally introduced him to the garrison at morning assembly. No title, no rank given, just a name. That told me more than a title would have. People who carry real authority rarely need to announce it. They let the silence around their name do the work. Solon spent his mornings walking the island's perimeter alone. Same route each time, but with small variations, pausing at different points, crouching to look at soil or stone. Sometimes he pressed one hand flat against the ground for long seconds. I felt those moments of contact clearly, not painful, more like being read. I felt those moments of contact clearly, not painful, more like being read. On day 6, he stopped at the northern edge, where the shell surface met the waterline. He crouched there for nearly 20 minutes. Then he took a small glass vial from his coat, filled it with water from the exact point where the island met the sea, sealed it, and labeled it. He had brought dozens of those vials, all labeled in a handwriting too small for anyone nearby to read. On day 8, he walked into the forest alone at dusk. I watched him through the pressure of his footsteps on my surface, each step a small distinct signal, like a finger tapping on a desk. He moved to the center, stood beside the freshwater lake, looked at the water for a long time without moving. Then he spoke, quietly, with no particular emotion. "I know you're aware of me." I went completely still, which, for something my size, is a very convincing impression of an ordinary island. "I'm not here to expose you," Solon continued, still looking at the water. "I'm here because the kingdom needs to understand what you are before someone less careful finds out first." He waited. The lake's surface was perfectly smooth. No one moved the trees. After a long moment, he nodded, as if confirming something to himself, and walked back toward the garrison. I spent that entire night processing what had just happened. In my first life, I had listened to thousands of people and learned to categorize them quickly. This one didn't fit any category I had. He wasn't frightened. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't trying to leverage what he suspected into personal advantage. He was doing exactly what he said he was doing, trying to understand, before someone worse arrived. That was either the most honest thing anyone had ever said to me, or the most sophisticated trap I had ever encountered. I decided to find out which. Slowly, on my own terms. The next morning, Solon came back to the lake at dawn, sat on a flat stone at the water's edge, and opened his journal. "Begin writing." I sent a single fish to the surface of the lake, a small silver one. It broke the surface once, caught the early light, and disappeared. Solon's pen stopped moving. He looked at the spot where the fish had been. Then he wrote something in his journal and kept going. Day 2 of our quiet exchange. I let the wind change direction around him specifically. A small warm current in a morning that was otherwise cool. Not enough to alarm anyone watching. Enough for him to notice. He noticed, made another note. Day 3. I grew a small mushroom overnight, directly in the center of the path he walked each morning. A species that didn't grow anywhere else on the island, that he would recognize as unusual. He crouched beside it for a long time. Didn't touch it, took out a small artist book and drew it precisely from 3 angles. Then he looked up at the sky, as if checking for witnesses, and said quietly, "Thank you. I'll be careful with this." System. 3rd acknowledgement received. Bond network expanding. New ability unlocked. Distant echo. The host may now send environmental signals at distances up to 2 miles beyond the shell boundary. 2 miles beyond myself. I could reach ships before they arrived. Warn them, guide them, or turn them away, silently, without ever revealing why. Solon and I had an agreement now, unspoken, careful, built out of small signals rather than words. The only kind of agreement I fully trusted. Meanwhile, the garrison had grown into something real. Arden had turned 80 soldiers and 20 builders into a functioning fort in under a year. The main structure was stone now, pulled from areas where my shell was thickest. Every stone they removed added an entry in the system. Shell resonance, plus 0.001% per extraction. Material transfer logged. Every stone they removed added a corresponding entry in the system. Shell resonance, plus 0.001% per extraction. Material transfer logged. Even the stones they took from me made me stronger in the taking. I had stopped being surprised by this. It seemed to be the fundamental logic of whatever I had become. The harbor had functioning docks now. Trade ships stopped regularly, 7 in the past month alone. The fee structure was fair enough that captains preferred Fort Turtle over cheaper alternatives. They were paying for safety, and they knew it was real. No ship that had docked here in good faith had ever left damaged. Word traveled fast among captains. Word had spread about the approaches, about the ships that had wrecked attempting hostile entry. Sailors talked, merchants talked more. Fort Turtle was becoming known as the safest anchorage on the crossing, not because of its guns, though Arden had added more, because of something else. Something captains couldn't name, but could feel when they entered the main harbor. The water was calmer, than it should be. The wind shifted helpfully at exactly the right moments. The harbor never silted. The freshwater well never ran dry regardless of how many ships drew from it. I was maintaining all of it, constantly, invisibly. The work had become a rhythm, like breathing. The island breathed in people and resources. I breathed out safety and calm water and wind in the right direction. 3 months after Solon arrived, a second letter came from the capital. I knew about it through Arden, felt his reaction when the courier ship arrived, felt the shift in his intentions from steady to something more guarded. The letter was longer than the first. Arden read it in his office with the door closed. He read it 3 times. Then he sent for Solon. I couldn't hear the words, but I could feel Arden's state throughout the meeting, careful, measured. The emotional signature of a man choosing each word with the precision of someone who suspects the room might have ears. He was right to suspect, though not in the way he imagined. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When Solon left, his usual composure was intact, but his footsteps had a different weight, heavier, purposeful. He went directly to the lake, sat on his stone, looked at the water, said nothing for a long time. Then, the capital is sending a governor. He arrives in 6 weeks. His name is Kevin Rel. He has authority to determine the island's official status and begin taxation of all trade. That passes through. A pause. Arden has orders to cooperate fully. I have orders to prepare a full report on the island's properties before Kevin Rel arrives. Another pause. Longer. I wanted you to know. I thought about that for the rest of the day. A governor. Official status. Taxation authority. In my first life, I had watched enough port cities to know what happened when a distant capital sent a governor to a place that had been running itself successfully. The place rarely improved, but governors could also be worked with, managed, given exactly what they needed to feel important while the real business of the island continued unchanged. I had 6 weeks to prepare, and I had one significant advantage that no governor could plan around. I was the island. There was no version of taking control of this place that didn't involve my cooperation. I began making changes, subtle ones, time to appear natural. The eastern approach, the clear channel I had maintained as the primary entry. I shifted slightly, beginning a slow process of silting that would require careful navigation to avoid. Not impassable, but requiring a local pilot who knew the current positions. I knew the current positions. Arden knew I was somehow involved in the harbor's safety, even if he didn't know the mechanism. Within 3 weeks, he would need to assign a harbor pilot for official traffic. The southern cove, which I had kept as a secondary anchorage, I improved quietly, deepened it, smoothed the bottom, created a natural stone formation on the western side that offered cover from open ocean swell. A private harbor, invisible from the main entry point, for ships that needed discretion. In my first life, every port city I had visited had 2 harbors. The official one, on the maps, and the tax records, and the other one, known only to people who needed to know. Every successful place had both. I also extended the tunnel network. The main east-west passage now ran almost the full length of my body. The side chambers had been carved out naturally, where the shell's internal structure created useful voids. The larger chambers sat directly beneath the central lake, accessible by diving 8 meters down through a submerged passage, then up into an air pocket large enough for 4 or 5 people to stand. The smaller chamber connected to the root system of the oldest trees in the forest. I hadn't planned that. It had happened naturally as I grew, and I had simply worked with it. I began filling both chambers, not with things, with information, with environmental cues that I arranged deliberately, the way a careful person arranges a room before a meeting. If the right person ever found those chambers, they would understand immediately that this island was aware and intentional, that it had been preparing. If the wrong person found them, they would see an interesting geological formation and some unusual root structures. Solon was writing his report. I could feel it in his daily rhythms, longer sessions at the lakeside, more deliberate walks. The quality of attention he gave to each part of the island, changing from exploratory to confirmatory. He was writing down what he already knew, organizing evidence he had collected over weeks into a document that would reach people far more powerful than himself. On day 4 of his report writing, he came to the lake at midday rather than dawn. Unusual. He sat for a moment, then said, "I need to ask you something directly. My report will determine how the capital treats this place. If I write what I believe to be true, Kevin Rel arrives with very different instructions than if I write what I can prove." He waited. I let the lake's surface ripple once, a small, deliberate way of moving outward from the center despite no wind. "I'll take that as you're listening," Solon said. "Here's my question. Do you want to be known, or do you want to remain unknown?" I thought about the question for a long time, longer than Solon expected, judging by the way he shifted on his stone. In my first life, being unknown had kept me alive and free. I had traveled for decades precisely because no one important knew my name or my face. But that was then. I was no longer a wanderer with nothing to protect. I had a forest now, a harbor, a garrison, people who had built lives here, on me, and who didn't know the thing beneath them was listening to their children play. Unknown meant vulnerable to the wrong kind of powerful person, someone who would arrive with authority and see only resources to extract. Known, to the right person, in the right way, meant something else, meant the possibility of an arrangement of terms. I sent my answer in 3 parts over the next 20 minutes. First, the wind picked up from the north, carrying the smell of open ocean, distance, freedom, the smell of a place that could not be owned. Then it stopped. Second, I grew 3 new flowers at Solon's feet, emerging from the stone itself, something impossible, unmistakable. Third, I stilled the lake's surface to absolute glass and held it that way for 60 seconds. Perfect. Controlled. Intentional. Solon watched all 3, made notes after each, then sat quietly for a moment. You want acknowledgement, he said. Not control. You want whoever comes next to know what they're dealing with, so they can make an informed choice. He paused. That's either wise or very dangerous, depending on who Caven Rel is. He was right. I had already worked through every angle of it myself. The risk was real, but the alternative, staying hidden while a governor made decisions about my future, based on incomplete information, felt worse. I had spent my first life giving people accurate information. Old habits. I had spent my first life giving people accurate information and trusting them to use it well. Old habits. The governor's ship arrived on a cold morning, ahead of schedule by for days. I felt it before I saw it, through the distant echo, 2 miles out. The weight of a large galleon moving with the particular deliberateness of an official vessel. 3 support ships behind it. Arden was on the dock when the governor's ship arrived. Full uniform, 20 soldiers in clean formation behind him, which I knew had taken 2 hours of preparation. The posture of a man receiving authority over him, executed with the contained dignity of someone who had built something real and knew it. Caven Rel came down the gangplank slowly. He was younger than I expected, 40, perhaps, with a lean face of someone who spent more time calculating than eating. Fine coat, nothing ostentatious. Careful eyes that moved across the harbor, the fort, the garrison, in a sequence that was clearly a practiced assessment. He shook Arden's hand, said something I couldn't hear from the water. Arden nodded once. Then Caven Rel turned and looked at the island. Not the fort or the harbor. The island itself, the trees, the high central ground. The place where the forest thickened and went quiet. He looked for a long time, the way Solon had looked on his first day, but with a different quality behind the eyes. Solon had looked like a man trying to understand something. Caven Rel looked like a man trying to determine what something was worth. I noted the difference carefully. Over the first 3 days, Caven Rel was thorough, systematic, and courteous. He reviewed Arden's records, met with the licensed merchants, walked the perimeter with a secretary who wrote down everything the governor said. He was building an assessment. I watched it take shape through the ambient information that moved around him, the questions he asked, the numbers he requested. The way his attention sharpened at certain answers told me exactly what he cared about. Trade volume, garrison cost versus revenue, and the reason the harbor was considered exceptionally safe. Arden answered the first 2 questions with the calm precision of a man who had kept meticulous records. The third question he answered simply. The island's natural geography was unusually favorable. Caven Rel accepted that answer, wrote it down. I felt, through my bond with Arden, that the commander was not comfortable with the simplification, but had decided it was sufficient for now. Solon delivered his report on day 4. I watched the governor read it from a distance, watched him slow in certain sections, reread others, set it down twice. He looked at the ceiling before picking the report up again. A man who does that has just read something that changed the shape of his assumptions. That told me everything about what Solon had written. It took him 2 hours. When he finished, he summoned Solon. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. When Solon came out, he walked directly to the lake without stopping to speak to anyone. He didn't sit down this time, stood at the water's edge and spoke quietly and quickly, like someone delivering a message under time pressure. He believes the report, Solon said. He's not afraid. He's interested. He wants to meet a harbor pilot who knows the approaches intimately. Someone who can guarantee safe passage for high-value ships on a contract basis. Solon paused. He's already thinking about how to monetize what you are. without understanding what you are. That's either an advantage for you or a significant problem. The lake stayed still. I was thinking, a man who wanted to monetize the island's unusual properties without asking too many questions about their source. That was, in many ways, a better outcome than a man who wanted to investigate and expose. But monetization had a logic of its own. It created incentives, and incentives created pressures, and pressures had a way of pushing people toward decisions that made short-term sense and long-term disasters. I had watched that sequence play out in a dozen port cities in my first life. I had written the story down every time. I knew how it ended. I needed to get ahead of it. The harbor pilot position Cave and Rel wanted, I could provide that through a proxy, a human face for the island's knowledge of its own approaches. I spent 3 days identifying the right person. Among the garrison was a young soldier named Dav, not a soldier by nature, clearly, but assigned here for lack of other options. He spent every free hour at the water's edge, watching ships enter and leave, reading the harbor, the way I had once read cities. He had the instinct, he just didn't have the information. I began teaching him, through island echo, through wind patterns and current behavior, that a careful observer could learn to read. Through the way I managed the water in the main channel, making certain behaviors predictable for someone paying close attention. Within 3 weeks, Dav could read the harbor's moods the way I had intended, could tell from the color of the water near the eastern reef whether the hidden approach was passable, could read the wind behavior near the northern current and know whether a heavy ship should wait. He thought he had simply developed a skill. He had. I had simply accelerated the process considerably. On the day Cave and Rel formally requested the appointment of a harbor pilot, Arden nominated Dav without hesitation. The commander had been watching the young soldier's increasing accuracy. At the water's edge 4 weeks, Cave and Rel interviewed Dav for 20 minutes. The young man answered every question correctly, not because I had told him the answers, but because he had genuinely learned to read the signals I had been consistently providing. The governor appointed him harbor pilot with a formal salary, a uniform, and an instruction to be available to all vessels entering on official business. Dav accepted with a seriousness that suggested he understood the weight of what he was being given, which he did, just not the full weight. Not yet. The taxation structure Cave and Rel established was, to my surprise, reasonable. He had done his calculations carefully, a rate high enough to make the capital satisfied, low enough that trade captains would still prefer Fort Turtle over alternatives. He was not, I realized, a man who killed the thing that made him money. He stayed for 6 weeks, never tried to extract more than the place could give. That was a quality I respected. When he left, he took Solon's report, Dav's harbor map, and a plan to triple the garrison and add a lighthouse. Fort Turtle would become an official way station of the Stone Kingdom's Eastern Maritime Network. Name.map.text, protected by the full authority of a sovereign state, and, for the first time, protected by the full authority of a major kingdom. I watched his fleet sail away and considered what had just changed. In 12 months, I had gone from a fist-sized turtle in cold water to an official strategic asset of a sovereign state. 300 people now live on my back. Ships stopped here regularly. My name, or at least the island's name, appeared in the Stone Kingdom's maritime records. And none of the 300 people who lived here had any idea what they were living on. I thought about that, turned it over from every angle. Solon knew, or believed enough to treat it as knowledge. Arden suspected, deeply enough that he had made his private acknowledgement and asked no more questions. Dav was learning to read me, without knowing what he was reading. That was the right distribution, I decided. Enough people with enough knowledge to keep the island safe. Not so many that the information became uncontrollable. The system registered the shift in a way I hadn't expected. Threshold reached. Social integration, level 1. The host has established functional relationships with human inhabitants. New development branch available, resident trust. Human inhabitants who interact regularly with the island develop enhanced intuition, physical resilience, and navigation ability at a rate proportional to the depth of their connection. Resident trust. The people who lived here longest and engaged most deeply with the island would become, quietly and without knowing why, slightly better at the things this place needed them to be good at. Ardent soldiers would become more reliable in a storm. Dav would read the water better with each passing month. The merchants would develop better instincts for which trades to take and which to decline. The island would make the people who trusted it into better versions of themselves. And they would, in return, protect it, not out of obligation, out of the particular attachment people develop for a place that has never once let them down. In my first life, I had visited hundreds of ports and towns. I had always been able to tell, within a day. Which ones were genuinely beloved by the people who lived there? Those places had a quality that was difficult to describe precisely, but impossible to miss. Once you knew to look for it, I understood now, for the first time, where the quality came from. The lighthouse went up over for months. Stone, 40 feet, with a light mechanism that two of the builders had designed and I had subtly improved. Not enough that anyone would notice, just enough that the light's range exceeded what the mechanism should have been capable of. Ships could see Fort Turtle from 15 miles out now, and weather that should have made it invisible. The second garrison arrived in spring. 200 more soldiers, for more licensed merchants, a physician, to teachers, and 14 civilians, families of soldiers who had requested transfer. Children arrived on the island for the first time. I noticed this in a way I hadn't expected. The Resonant Trust ability had, until now, registered adult inhabitants in its calculations. It hadn't accounted for children. The system updated without prompting. New variable registered. Juvenile inhabitants generate proportionally stronger life energy return than adults. Ratio 2.3x per individual. Children generated more than twice the life energy of adults. I thought about why, and eventually arrived at an answer that felt right. Children engaged with a place completely. Without reservation, without transaction, without calculation. They climbed my trees, played in the shallows, dug in the soil, named things. A group of 4 children had named the old tree at the forest's western edge Gerald. I learned this from 2 mothers talking near the well, and visited it every morning before lessons. I grew 3 new branches on Gerald overnight. Low ones, perfect for climbing, at angles that made it easy to get up and somewhat harder to fall. I couldn't explain why I did that. I just did it. 6 months into the expanded garrison, something changed in the wider ocean that I felt before any ship brought the news. The signal came through the water, through the deep pressure network I had developed, which now gave me a rough sense of large-scale movements across a 40-mile radius. A pattern of ship traffic that I had learned to read the way a person reads weather. The pattern was wrong. Traffic that normally moves steadily north to south was clustering, stopping, rerouting. Something was blocking the main trade corridor 80 miles to the north. Something large enough that dozens of ships were changing course to avoid it. Dev noticed it too, in the harbor, in the behavior of the ships that arrived over the next 2 weeks. Captains who stopped at Fort Turtle now lingered. They spoke to each other quietly at the docks. They bought more provisions than usual. They were preparing for something, or preparing to wait out something. On the 15th day, a fast courier sloop arrived from the north. The crew had the look of men who had been moving without sleep. They delivered a message to Arden directly. He read it in the open air, which he rarely did, which meant the message was meant to be known, not kept private. He called assembly and stood before everyone on the island, 500 soldiers and every civilian, and spoke without theatrics. He stood before 500 soldiers and every civilian on the island and spoke without theatrics. The way experienced commanders deliver information that will change everything. A war fleet of the Red Confederation, 47 ships, the largest assembled in this region in 30 years, had destroyed the Stone Kingdom's northern harbor and was moving south. Their stated purpose, to claim the eastern maritime trade routes as Confederation territory. Anyway, station or fort flying the Stone Kingdom flag was a legitimate military target. Fort Turtle flew the Stone Kingdom flag, had flown it for 2 years. 47 ships were coming, and I had never faced anything close to that. I went very still, deep beneath the surface, in the way I always went still when I needed to think without interruption. Let the current move around me. Let the harbor above go about its business. 47 ships, against 1 harbor, 1 galleon, and whatever I could do with 5 miles of controlled ocean approaches. In my first life, faced with odds like that, I would have walked quietly in the other direction and written a story about someone else's war. I didn't have that option anymore. There were 14 children named a tree in my forest Gerald. There were 300 people whose lives had been built on top of mine. I was not going to walk away from this. I was going to need a better plan than anything I had tried before, and I was going to need to start building it right now. I had faced predators before, sharks, whirlpools, the crushing pressure of deep ocean trenches. I had faced all of them by being patient, by being harder than whatever hit me. 47 warships were not a whirlpool. They were a decision. Someone had signed a document and sent those ships with a purpose. That was a different kind of problem. 47 warships were not a whirlpool. They were a decision. Someone, somewhere, had sat in a room and signed a document and sent those ships with a purpose. That was a different kind of problem entirely. I spent 3 days thinking before I moved a single current. The first thing I needed to understand was the fleet itself. Not the number. Numbers were just numbers. I needed to understand how it moved, where it would come from, and what it was actually trying to accomplish. Through the distant echo, I mapped its approach over 5 days. The fleet was moving in formation, tight, disciplined, the kind of movement that meant experienced commanders and drilled crews. They were coming from the northwest, following the deep water channel that ran parallel to the coast. The channel leading directly to my northern approach, the one I had protected with a strong opposing current. For a single ship, impassable. For 47 moving at speed, it would slow them. It would not stop them. For a single ship, the current was impassable. For 47 ships moving together at speed, it would slow them. It would not stop them. I needed to think differently, bigger. The way I had thought when I decided to enter the whirlpool, instead of avoiding it. The problem wasn't the ships. The problem was the water between us. And the water was mine. I began with information. Sent off to the northern watchtower at dawn with a specific message, not spoken, but delivered through the harbor's behavior. The current near the tower shifted in a pattern Dov had learned to read over months. Unusual. Urgent. Pay attention. He was on the tower within 20 minutes, telescope raised, scanning the northwest horizon. He saw them on the second morning. 47 sails, far enough away that they looked like a cloud formation, close enough that Dov knew exactly what they were. He ran to Arden without stopping. I felt the shift in the garrison's energy the moment the news spread, a tightening, like a fist slowly closing. Arden did not panic. He never panicked. He called an immediate council, himself, his senior officers, Solon, and Dov. Solon came to the lake that evening, earlier than usual, moving quickly. You already know, he said. It wasn't a question. I let a ripple move across the lake from the center outward. Yes, Arden is planning a defensive formation. Stone Kingdom naval doctrine, concentrated fire from the harbor mouth, use the force elevated position for angle advantage. That's a good plan against 20 ships. He paused. It's not a plan against 47. Another ripple. I know. What are you going to do? I gave him 3 answers, in sequence. First, the wind above the lake shifted west, away from the island, outward, pushing. Second, I grew a new reed at the water's edge, fast enough that Solon watched it happen in real time. Slow, deliberate growth with intention behind it. Third, I stilled everything, wind, water, the movement of leaves, into absolute silence for 10 full seconds. Solon sat with those 3 signals for a long time. Then he said, you're going to push them away. You're going to grow something they can't predict. And then you're going to go completely quiet so they don't know where the threat is coming from. He was the most accurate reader I had encountered. I sent one final signal. The warm current I used for agreement moved under the lake's surface, just enough to raise the temperature slightly near where his hand rested on the stone. Solon felt it, pulled his hand back slowly, looked at it. I'll keep Arden focused on the harbor defense, he said quietly. Give you room to work. I began that night. The first element was the northern current. I strengthened it, not to impassable, but to something that would force the fleet to slow and realign. A fleet that slows and realigns breaks its formation. A fleet that breaks formation makes decisions under pressure, and decisions under pressure are rarely the best decisions. The second element was the reef network I had been building for 8 months. The hidden formation south and east of my main body, carefully placed below visibility depth. I had never activated them fully. It kept them as passive obstacles. I activated them now, extended them, added new formations over 48 hours, working at the edge of my range, pushing the living barrier ability harder than I ever had. System, living barrier expanded beyond standard range. Warning, extended range operation reduces precision. Accept reduced precision. Yes, no, yes. Precision was a luxury. Coverage was a necessity. The formations weren't designed to sink ships. I wasn't trying to sink 47 ships. I was trying to funnel them, channel their approach into a specific corridor, narrow, controllable, where the numbers stopped meaning what they meant in open water. The third element was the deep current network, the pressure channels I had built over months to sense movement across 40 miles. I had used them passively, as a sensing system. Now I reverse them, active pressure waves, rhythmic pulses moving outward from my body through the deep channels, too subtle for human instruments to detect, but not too subtle for the sea itself. The ocean responds to pressure the way air responds to sound. Push it in the right pattern, and the surface behavior changes, currents shift, wave patterns alter. The water develops a personality that a skilled captain reads as warning without knowing why. Sailors had a name for it. They called it bad water. Sailors had a name for it. They called it bad water. Every experienced captain had sailed into bad water at some point and turned around without being able to explain the decision rationally afterward. They just knew. I was making 40 miles of bad water. On the third day, 2 of the 47 ships slowed. On the fourth day, 1 turned back, then another. Not retreating, repositioning, moving around the edge of the bad water zone, looking for a cleaner approach. The repositioning took time. It cost the fleet its tight formation. It pushed the approach quarter exactly where I needed it, toward the eastern channel. The one clean route I had maintained and that Dove had mapped for the Stone Kingdom. That channel was clean because I kept it clean, because I controlled it completely. The fleet commander was not stupid. I could feel the ship's behavior change over those for days, the way the formation adapted, the way they tested different angles. He was treating the unusual water behavior as an obstacle to root around, rather than a weapon being used against him. Good instincts, wrong conclusion. By day 5, the fleet was committed to the eastern approach. 40 ships now. 5 had broken off entirely, either turned back or repositioned afar to rejoin in time. 42 was still 42, but 42 in a narrow channel was a different problem than 42 in open water. Arden had his garrison in full defensive position by dawn on day 5. Every gun loaded, every soldier at post. The lighthouse dark. Dove had killed the light on my signal, removing the navigation aid the fleet had been using to orient. Without the lighthouse, and a channel that was clean only because I chose to keep it clean, the fleet was navigating by memory and dead reckoning. I waited until the lead ships were committed, deep enough in the channel. That turning back would be a complicated maneuver requiring time and clear water they didn't have. Then I changed the eastern channel. Not dramatically, not a sudden reef wall or a current wall slowly. The way tides change, the way the ocean shifts at dusk when no one is watching. The floor of the channel rose to meters over 6 hours, gradual enough that no depth measurement would catch the change in real time. The current I had maintained through the channel reversed, not reversed sharply, but softened, then stilled, then began moving back against the fleet's direction. And the wave pattern on the channel's surface changed character, developing the choppy unpredictability of shallow water over an uneven bottom. The lead ships felt it first. Their speed dropped. Their pilots, men who had studied charts of this channel and trusted those charts, began calling soundings and getting numbers. That didn't match what they expected. Confusion in the lead ship spread backward through the formation. The fleet slowed across the board. System, shell resonance passive activation detected. Fleet vessel impacts with underwater formations, 847 separate impacts logged, plus 0.001% shell density per impact. Total density increased this engagement, plus 0.847%, 847 in 6 hours. More than I had accumulated in the first 3 months of deliberate training. The fleet wasn't attacking me. They were simply moving through water I had made complicated, and their hulls were bumping against formations I had grown, and every bump was making me stronger. I kept going. On the 6th hour of the channel operation, the fleet commander made the decision I had been waiting for. He signaled a halt, full stop, all ships, hold position. A commander who halts in a difficult channel is a commander who is reassessing, who is asking the question, is this worth it? That question was exactly where I needed him. Arden saw the halt from the fort. Through my bond with him I felt the shift, surprise, then calculation, then the particular quality of attention that a good commander gives to an unexpected opportunity. He sent Solon a message. I felt it as a change in Solon's movements, quick, purposeful, heading for the harbor. Dove was at the harbor already. He had been reading the water for hours, watching things happen that no chart explained, understanding more of the truth with every hour that passed. When Solon arrived, Dove turned to him and said, with the simple directness of someone who has stopped pretending, "The island is doing this." Solon looked at him for a moment. Then, yes, all of it, the current, the formations, the channel changing, yes. Dove turned back to the water. "Good," he said, "just that good," and went back to reading the harbor with the focused calm of a man who had just had his deepest instinct confirmed. I had not expected that response. I filed it carefully. The people who lived here were, quietly and without announcement, becoming the kind of people a place like this needed. The fleet stayed halted for 4 hours. Then, as the tide shifted into the late afternoon, a tide I had been managing for 3 days, I made one final adjustment. The eastern channel, which had been tightening and shallowing for 6 hours, developed a new characteristic, the kind of water behavior experienced sailors associated with one specific situation. A tidal bore approaching. Not a real bore, but the surface signs were identical to the early warnings. The choppy pattern, the sound, the way wave frequency compressed at the channel edges. Not a real bore. I couldn't generate that much water movement, but the surface signs were identical to the early warnings. The choppy pattern, the particular sound, the way the wave frequency compressed at the channel edges. Every captain in that fleet who had ever encountered a tidal bore knew what came next. A wall of water, fast, unpredictable, capable of taking a ship broadside and rolling it in 30 seconds. I hadn't made a tidal bore. I had made the idea of a tidal bore, the fear of one, in a channel where 42 ships sat at rest, unable to turn quickly, in water they no longer trusted. The fleet moved, not toward the island, away from it. The retreat was ordered, not panicked. The fleet commander was still in control, but he was moving his ships out of the channel and back into open water. And in open water my reach was limited, and he would regroup and reassess and likely come back. But not today, and today was enough. The moment the last ship cleared the channel, I released the pressure. Let the current return to its usual direction. Let the wave pattern calm. Let the channel floor settle back down over the next 12 hours. By morning, the eastern channel would look exactly as it had always looked. The charts would be accurate again. Any ship entering now would find clean, deep, well-behaved water. Any ship except the 42 that had just been driven out of it. Arden called assembly again that evening, his second in a week. He stood before his people and reported what they had all seen. The fleet of the Red Confederation had engaged the island's approach channels and retreated without a single exchange of fire. The garrison cheered, the civilians cheered, the children cheered, though most of them didn't fully understand what had happened. Gerald the tree was visible from the assembly ground. I made its leaves move in calm air, gently, in the particular pattern I had developed over months that meant something close to acknowledgement. Nobody saw it except Dove, who was standing at the back of the assembly, and Solon, who was standing slightly apart from everyone else. They both looked at the tree for a moment, then at each other, then back at Arden, who was still speaking. I had driven away a fleet of 47 ships without firing a single gun, without losing a single person. I had, in the space of 6 days, repelled a fleet 50 times the size of Fort Turtle's garrison without firing a single gun, without losing a single person, and without any enemy captain understanding what had actually happened to them. The fleet commander's report would say, unusual navigational hazards, unpredictable water behavior, strategic withdrawal. He wasn't wrong about any of it. He just didn't have a category for the real explanation. The Stone Kingdom's response arrived 2 weeks later. A fast courier, carrying a message for Arden and a sealed letter for Solon. Arden's message, commendation, expanded authority, and orders to prepare Fort Turtle for a formal royal inspection within 6 months. Solon's letter, I never learned its full contents, but I felt its effect on him clearly. He came to the lake that evening looking different. Not troubled exactly, carrying something heavier than he usually carried. He sat for a long time without speaking. Then, the king knows, not the details, but he knows something extraordinary is here, and he wants to understand it before deciding what to do. Solon paused. The inspection isn't just ceremony. There will be people with the delegation who are specifically tasked with evaluating the island's strategic and economic potential. And there will be at least one person whose job is to determine whether what's here represents an asset or a threat. Asset or threat, two words I had learned across lifetimes, were the most dangerous framing in the world, because people who thought in those terms rarely left space for a third option. I needed to think carefully about what I wanted the inspection to find. Over the following weeks I prepared, not the way Arden was preparing, scrubbing stones and polishing armor, and rehearsing formal greetings. I prepared the way I had prepared for the fleet, by shaping the environment that the visitors would move through. The island's north side, which had been mostly wild forest, I developed deliberately, not into anything obviously constructed, no buildings, no clearings. But the forest itself became more navigable. Paths that seemed natural appeared between the oldest trees. The undergrowth thinned in specific places. The bird population, already dense, arranged itself in ways that any naturalist would find remarkable. I created new features I had been planning for months. The first was a spring on the eastern slope, fresh, cold, clean, that emerged from an opening in the rock at exactly the right position to flow downhill through the forest toward the harbor, creating a small stream that hadn't existed before. Springs were trustworthy. Springs were generous. A place that offered fresh water from solid rock was a place that wanted people near it. The second feature was more deliberate. In the large underground chamber beneath the lake, I had been working for months on something that required the most precise application of shell architecture I had attempted. The chamber walls were stone, my own shell, compressed and shaped over years. I had, over those months, been pressing that stone into patterns. Not random, not natural, geometric, repeating. I had seen in the oldest temples and ruins, in places where the people who built them were trying to communicate something across time to people they would never meet. I was not a temple builder. I had no religion, no ritual, no mythology I was trying to preserve. But I had spent a lifetime collecting stories, and I knew that the most durable medium for a story was stone. And I knew that the right person, finding the right chamber, would understand what the patterns meant. The patterns said, I have been here for longer than your kingdom. I have been building longer than your civilization. I am not your asset. I am not your threat. I am something you don't have a category for yet, and I am patient enough to wait while you develop one. Whether anyone would ever find the chamber, I didn't know. The entrance was 8 meters underwater, in the floor of the lake, accessible only to someone who knew exactly where to look. Solon knew the lake well. He had been studying it for months. I waited to see whether he would look. He looked on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the inspection announcement. Came to the lake before dawn, alone, with a small waterproof lantern and the particular quality of purpose. That meant he had been deciding to do this for a while. He dove without hesitation, stayed under for nearly 2 minutes, longer than I expected for a man who appeared to live primarily on land. When he surfaced, he floated on his back in the center of the lake for a long moment, looking up at the lightening sky. Then he swam to the stone and sat there dripping, not speaking, for almost an hour. Finally, how long did it take you to make that? I grew a vine on the rock beside him at a speed he could watch, visibly, intentionally, faster than any plant should grow. Started it from bare stone and brought it to full leaf in about 40 seconds. Solon watched the whole thing, then nodded slowly. That's not an answer, he said. That's a demonstration of capability. He was right. I let a small fish rise to the surface and hold there, motionless, for exactly 3 seconds. Then it dove. 3 seconds. 3 years. My rough estimate of how long the chamber had taken. Solon did the math, looked at the lake's surface where the fish had been. You've been planning this since before the garrison arrived, he said. Not a question this time. A statement. The statement of a man who had just recalibrated everything he thought he understood about the situation he was in. He sat with that recalibration for a while. Then, I need to think about what to tell them. What I show the inspection team matters more than almost anything else at this point. I can frame this in a way that protects you, or I can frame it in a way that doesn't. He paused. I need to know one thing first. The people who live here, Arden, Dav, the families, the children, are they safe? Not just from outside threats, from you. The lake went completely still. I held it that way for a long moment. Then I let the surface warm, slowly, the way it warmed on summer afternoons when the sun had been on it for hours. Warm the way something warm is when it has been keeping something safe for a long time. Solon put his hand on the water surface, felt the temperature. He was quiet for a long time. All right, he said finally. I believe you. He stood up, looked at the lake one more time, then at the forest around it, and the sky above, and the stone under his feet, at the island, at me. I'll frame it as a natural phenomenon of unusual and strategically valuable properties, he said. Geothermal activity explaining the water temperature. Unusual mineral composition explaining the current behavior. Exceptional natural harbor geometry. The kind of report that explains everything and understands nothing. He started walking back toward the garrison. Stopped after a few steps. For what it's worth, he said, without turning around, you're the strangest thing I've ever encountered. And I've spent 20 years looking for strange things. He walked away. I watched him go through the movement of leaves overhead. I had, over the course of this conversation, made a choice. Not the kind of choice I had made easily. In my first life, I had trusted people carefully and selectively, because experience had taught me that trust given too quickly was the most expensive thing in the world. But I had been watching Solon for months, and what I had seen, consistently, was a man who told the truth when he could and protected what he valued when he couldn't. A man who asked hard questions and sat with uncomfortable answers. A man who, when he found something extraordinary, wanted to understand it rather than own it. Those were the people worth trusting, in any world, in any life. The royal inspection was 6 weeks away. There was much to prepare, and for the first time since my second life began, I was not preparing alone. Arden, Solon, Dav, 3 people who knew different parts of the truth, each protecting it in the way that fit their nature. The soldier who asked no questions and kept the harbor safe. The scholar who asked all the questions and wrote reports that explained everything and understood nothing. The pilot who said good and went back to reading the water. 3 people, an island, and a king's inspection coming that would determine whether this place remained what it had become, or became something else entirely. I had faced a whirlpool. I had faced 47 ships. I had faced a governor who thought in terms of assets and threats. A king was different. A king could make decisions that no current could redirect and no channel modification could prevent. A king could decide, with a single word, that what lived here should be removed or contained or used in ways I had not consented to. I spent a long time in the deep dark of my own internal chambers, thinking about that, about what it meant to be powerful but not sovereign, about what it meant to want something for the people who lived on you, and to understand that want was not the same as control. In my first life, I had written down the stories of people who built things, cities, empires, families, libraries. Every one of them had faced the same moment eventually, the moment when what you had built became visible to someone with the power to take it. What you did in that moment determined everything that came after. The inspection was coming. The king's people were coming. And I was a turtle at the bottom of an ocean, lying still, thinking, the same as I had always been, just with an empire on my back now, and a decision to make that would echo through every year of the very long life I intended to live. The Royal Inspection Fleet appeared on a clear morning in early autumn. 5 ships. The lead vessel flew the Stone Kingdom's banner, gold and deep blue, snapping in wind I kept favorable since dawn. I had been awake all night thinking, the way I thought before things that mattered. Not anxious, just still and ready. I had been awake all night, not anxious, just thinking, the way I thought before things that mattered. The fleet entered the eastern channel without difficulty. I held the current steady, the depth clean, the bottom smooth. No complications, no demonstrations of anything. Just a well-behaved harbor receiving important guests. Arden met them at the dock in full ceremonial uniform. The garrison was assembled into clean lines. Every stone in the fort had been scrubbed. Every gun was polished. The children had been asked to wear their best clothes and stand with their families. Near the harbor square, I had grown fresh flowers along the path from the dock to the fort's main gate. Nobody noticed they hadn't been there the day before. The king's representative was a woman named Isaravale, not the king himself. I had not expected the king himself, and I was glad of it. A representative meant space, room for nuance. A direct royal visit meant decisions made on first impressions. Isaravale came down the gangplank with the unhurried movement of a person who had done this many times and knew that hurrying told you nothing. She was 60, perhaps, with gray hair pulled back cleanly and eyes that moved across the harbor, the fort, the garrison, and the civilian population in one long, practiced sweep. She shook Arden's hand, said something brief. Then she looked at the island behind him, not the fort, not the people, the island itself. The trees, the slope of the ground, the place where everything was growing. She looked for a long time. I noted the quality of her attention, different from Caven Rel's. He had looked at the island and seen value. She was looking at it and asking a question I couldn't immediately identify. Her delegation included 12 people, an admiral, 2 military engineers, a court naturalist, 3 administrative officials, and 4 individuals who carried no obvious title and introduced themselves with names and nothing else. The 4 without titles were the ones Solon had warned me about, the ones whose job was to determine what this place really was. I watched all 4 of them carefully for the first 3 days. One was a geologist. I identified him by the way he handled stones, the specific places he looked, the kind of samples he collected. Thorough, systematic, not a threat. One was a naturalist of the living world, plants, animals, growth patterns. She spent full days in the forest and came out looking thoughtful. She had found things she couldn't categorize. I had made sure of it. One was a maritime strategist. He walked the harbor, the channel approaches, the defensive positions, made notes, calculated fields of fire, and approach vectors. Competent, working within a framework I understood. The 4th was the one I watched most carefully. She was young, 30, perhaps, and she did something none of the others did. She didn't study any one thing. She moved between everything. She watched the garrison, then the harbor, then the children near Gerald's tree, then stood at the water's edge for an hour doing nothing visible. She was looking for the shape of something, the pattern connecting all the observations. That kind of thinking I knew well. It was how I had once walked from city to city, collecting stories that were really the same thing in different languages. On day 3 she did something unexpected. She came to the lake alone, in the early afternoon when most of the delegation was occupied with formal briefings. She didn't sit, didn't speak. She walked the perimeter of the lake slowly, looking at the water, touching the stones at the edge, pausing at the place where Solon always sat. Then she stopped and looked directly at the center of the lake and waited. I considered that for a moment. She was not doing what Solon had done. Solon had come with evidence and hypothesis, looking to confirm. She was doing something different. She was simply presenting herself, making herself available. That was either very sophisticated or very intuitive. Both possibilities made her interesting. I sent a single ripple across the lake from the center dot, small, controlled, clearly not wind. She watched it reach the shore, watched the water settle. Then she took out a small notebook and wrote one line. I couldn't read it from my position, but she wrote it quickly, as if she had been waiting to write it. Then she left. She came back the next morning at the same time. Same posture, same waiting quality. I sent a different signal this time. A warm current rising gently along the western edge of the lake, making the surface temperature measurably different in that specific area. The kind of differential that only existed if something deep and deliberate was controlling the water from below. She walked to the western edge, put her hand in, felt the temperature, moved 3 feet to the east, cooler, back to the warm edge. Her expression didn't change much, but she wrote 3 lines in her notebook this time. On the third visit, I showed her something I had shown no one except Solon. I grew a flower at the exact center of the lake's surface, not from a floating seed, from nothing visible, rising from beneath the surface slowly, fully formed, blooming as it reached the air. She watched the entire process without moving. When it was finished, she sat down on the stone at the water's edge, Solon's stone, and stayed there for a long time. Then she spoke, quietly, without drama. I've been to 17 islands in the past 8 years, she said. 12 of them were sites the Crown considered strategically significant. 2 were places the Crown considered anomalous. A pause. There's something else entirely. She closed her notebook, looked at the flower, still floating at the center of the lake. I'm not going to pretend I understand what you are, but I'd like to understand what you want, because in my experience, things this deliberate always want something. That was the most direct question anyone had ever asked me. The old fisherman had said thank you. Arden had made a private acknowledgement. Dov had said good and gone back to work. Solon had asked whether the people here were safe. This woman was asking about purpose, about intention. I thought about how to answer it. I grew 3 things simultaneously. First, the reeds at the lake's edge grew taller and denser. Shelter, protection, a wall between the lake and the open air. Second, a small channel formed in the stone where the spring water ran, directing the flow more deliberately toward the harbor. Contribution, provision. Third, the flower at the center of the lake divided and became 3 flowers, spreading slowly outward from the center. Growth, expansion, life generating more life. She watched all 3, made notes on each, then sat quietly for a while. Protection, she said. Service, expansion. Another pause, and all of it growing from the same center. She stood up, looked at the lake one final time. I'll do what I can, she said, and walked back toward the garrison. Her name, I learned days later through a conversation Solon had with one of the administrative officials, was Mari. She held the title of Crown Interpreter, a position with no equivalent in the standard administrative hierarchy, created specifically for situations the standard hierarchy couldn't process. A person whose official job was to understand things that didn't fit the existing categories. The kingdom had created that position, and then they had sent her here. I thought about what that meant, about the kind of institution that builds a role like Crown Interpreter and fills it with someone like Mari. It meant the kingdom had encountered unexplainable things before, had chosen understanding over elimination, had decided, at some point, that the correct response to the inexplicable was not destruction, but relationship. That changed what I thought about the kingdom, and it changed what I was willing to risk. Solon came to the lake on the 5th evening of the inspection. After the formal dinner he had attended in the fort's newly finished Great Hall, he sat on his stone and spoke quietly. Mari asked to see my original report tonight, the real one, not the version I submitted officially. A pause. I told her there was no other version. He looked at the water. She said, tell the island I said hello. The lake went warm, completely, evenly warm, the way it could only be if everything beneath me was generating heat deliberately and simultaneously. Solon looked at the surface, said nothing for a moment. Then, she's going to recommend the Crown establish a formal protectorate arrangement. Not ownership, not a garrison expansion, a protectorate, meaning the Stone Kingdom extends its military protection to the island in exchange for the island's continued function as a way station and refuge. He paused. The arrangement would be between the Crown and the island, not between the Crown and Fort Turtle's commandant. She's writing it that way specifically. Between the Crown and the island, not the human settlement on the island, not the garrison or the merchants or the licensed trade. The island itself as a party to an agreement. No human legal system had a framework for that. It had never been written before, as far as I knew. Someone was inventing a new kind of relationship in real time, specifically because the existing categories didn't fit. I sent the warm current directly to the stone where Solon sat. Just that stone, precisely targeted, unmistakably intentional. He felt it, put both hands flat on the stone, sat very still for a moment. "I'll take that as approval," he said. On the 7th day, Asara Vale requested a private meeting with Arden and, separately, with Solon. The emotional signature of a commander being told something significant that required him to adjust his understanding of his own situation without losing his composure. He managed it. He managed it. Arden always managed. He had decided long ago that the world was full of things he didn't fully understand. He had decided long ago that a world full of inexplicable things was not a reason to stop functioning. The second meeting, Solon's, lasted much longer, nearly 3 hours. When it ended, Solon came to the lake immediately, still in his formal clothes. He sat down, didn't speak for 5 minutes. Then, "The Protectorate Agreement is being drafted tonight. It will be signed tomorrow before the fleet departs." He exhaled slowly. "Marit is named as the Crown's liaison to the island for the duration of the agreement. She'll return with a small permanent delegation in the spring. Not soldiers, scholars, naturalists, and one diplomatic official." A pause. "She asked to leave one message for the island directly. I told her I wasn't sure that was possible. She said she'd leave it anyway." Another pause. Longer. "She said, I look forward to learning the shape of what you want, in whatever language you choose to use." I stayed very still with that message for a long time, letting it settle alongside the old fisherman's "thank you, Arden's blood on the water," without a single word. The people worth trusting always said things that were simple and exactly right. It took courage to speak simply to something you didn't understand. It took courage to speak simply to something you didn't understand, rather than filling the silence with assumptions. I gave my answer the only way I knew how. Over the next 3 hours, while the inspection delegation slept and the garrison was quiet and the harbor lights burned steadily above my surface, I worked. I grew a new path through the forest, clear, walkable, leading from the garrison's eastern gate to the lake. Not a dramatic path, a gentle one, with the kind of ground cover that made walking easy without feeling constructed. The kind of path that appeared when a place wanted to be visited. At the lake's edge, at the spot where Marit had sat for the past 3 mornings, I raised the stone slightly and smoothed it, shaped it, over 3 hours, into something close to a seat. Not a throne, not a monument, a place to sit and look at water. The kind of thing you build for someone you expect to come back. And in the center of the lake, I kept the 3 flowers. Let them settle into the surface of the water, rooted now, real, permanent. Not a demonstration anymore, just flowers that live in the lake because I had put them there and intended for them to stay. In the morning, when Marit walked the new path to the lake and found the stone seat and the flowers, she stopped at the water's edge and looked at all of it for a long time. Then she smiled, briefly, privately, the smile of someone who has just received a letter they were hoping for. She sat down on the shaped stone, opened her notebook, and began writing. I watched her write and thought about what I had built. Not the harbor, not the tunnels, not the reef network or the pressure channels or the defensive formations that had driven away 47 ships. The other thing, the harder thing, a shell resonance that turned every impact into strength. A life anchor that made every living creature nearby part of the same growing system. A bond with the acknowledgement that let me feel the intentions of people who had chosen to recognize what I was. A distant echo that let me reach out beyond my own boundaries into the wider world. All of it had grown from the same starting point. A cold ocean, a fist-sized hurdle, the pressure of being small and alone and in water that wanted to crush you. You became strong by absorbing what tried to break you. You built something real by letting living things choose to be near you. You created trust by being consistently worth trusting, over time. Without exception, even when no one was watching. This was what I had learned in the deep water, in the dark, before any of this existed. The Protectorate Agreement was signed at noon on the 8th day. Asara Vale signed for the Stone Kingdom. Arden signed as the Forest Commandant. Solon signed as the Crown's witness. And then Mary did something not in the formal protocol. She walked to the main dock, where everyone could see, and crouched down and pressed one hand flat against the stone, my surface, and held it there for a moment. The entire delegation was watching. The garrison was watching. The civilians were watching. The children were watching. Nobody spoke. After a moment, she stood up, turned to the assembled crowd and said, simply, "The island acknowledges the agreement." Several people looked at each other. A few looked confused. Arden looked at the dock where her hand had been and then at the harbor, calm and bright in the autumn sun. Dav, standing at the far edge of the harbor, was not confused. He nodded once, the same nod the old fisherman had given, that Arden had given, that Solon had given. The nod that meant, confirmed. I had not acknowledged the agreement. Not formally, not consciously, not with anything that could be logged or recorded. But I had felt Marat's hand on my surface, and I had let the dock stone warm slightly under her palm. Just enough, just for the moment, and she had felt it, and she had told the truth about it in front of everyone, and nobody who mattered had missed what it meant. The fleet departed on the morning tide. I watched it go from beneath the surface. 5 ships, sails full, moving east toward the mainland and the capital and all the complicated machinery of a kingdom that had just made an agreement it didn't yet have the language to fully describe. Marit stood at the stern until the island dropped below the horizon. I held her in the distant echo, felt her direction of attention, the stillness of someone thinking about what they're leaving. Then she was gone, for now. I turned my attention back to what was on top of me. Fort Turtle, 340 people, a forest with birds, a lake with 3 flowers, an old tree named Gerald that for children visited every morning, a harbor pilot who could read my moods, a soldier who had made a private ritual and asked no further questions, a harbor pilot who could read my moods better than any instrument, a soldier who had made a private ritual and asked no further questions, a scholar who wrote reports that explained everything and understood nothing on purpose to protect something he valued, a stone seat at the water's edge, shaped over 3 hours in the dark, for a woman who asked what you wanted rather than what you were worth. I had come from nothing, the most literal possible nothing, a body the size of a fist in cold water with for flippers and no plan. I had survived by being unbreakable. I had grown by seeking pressure rather than avoiding it. I had become something real by letting the right people recognize what I was, and trusting them with the parts of the truth they could carry. The system had one final message. It had been waiting, I thought, for this exact moment. Integration threshold reached. The host has established sustained, reciprocal relationships with human civilization. New designation available. Living sovereign. A living sovereign is not a resource, not a territory, not a strategic asset. Living sovereign is a recognized party, capable of agreement, of intention, of consequence. Do you accept this designation? I stayed very still in the cold, dark water beneath everything I had built, and everything that lived above me. Then I answered yes. The system processed that for a long moment. Then, living sovereign status confirmed. All previous abilities retained and upgraded. New ability unlocked. Deep memory. The host may now retain and transmit knowledge across centuries, independent of any external record. What you know cannot be lost. What you build cannot be forgotten, not by you and not by the ocean. Deep memory. Everything I had learned in this life and the last one. Every story I had collected. Every person I had known. Every current I had mapped, and every reef I had grown, and every signal I had sent, and every hand I had felt on my surface. All of it permanent. All of it mine. I was a turtle in the ocean. I had a forest and a harbor and a protectorate agreement with a sovereign nation and a stone seat shaped for a woman who wanted to understand me. I had started as the weakest thing in the water. I had become the thing the water moved around. And I had a very, very long life ahead of me. I intended to use every year of it if you made it to the end. Drop a comment with one word that describes this story. The most unexpected word gets penned.